Hello and welcome. Welcome to everyone who's watching us online. I'm so happy that we can all be here worshiping together. I feel bad. I feel bad for the people who don't think that they are stars because they don't feel like stars. I feel bad for the people who don't think they are stars because they don't feel like they are stars. Because feelings lie. Because feelings are shallow. Because feelings don't determine who you are. And I think that is something that a lot of people struggle with. The student who thinks that they're a star student because they feel like a star student, because they get all A pluses on every single quiz or paper, but then they have one bad grade, and what happens? They don't feel like a star student anymore, and so their whole identity crumbles. I feel bad for them. Or the teen who thinks that they're the most feels like a popular star amongst their friends and their peers, and everyone likes them, and everyone's happy to see them, but then there's one bad photo of them posted on social media, and they no longer feel like a star. And so they don't think that they're a star. Crushes them. Or the guy who thinks that he's a hardworking American man, right? And he gets to work his job, and he feels great because he's able to provide for his family, and he feels like a star, but then gets injured, or loses his job, or retires, and no longer feels like a star. So he doesn't think he's a star, and he crumbles. Or the mom who feels like a star mother when the kids are well behaved and kids are telling them how much they love them, the house is cleaned, and then chaos happens, and you no longer feel like a star, and then you don't think you're a star mother because it's all crumbling, and it's just debilitating, right? I could just keep going probably for a very long time, but you guys get the point? Like, I feel bad for the person who doesn't think they're a star because they don't feel like they're a star. And I want to make sure that doesn't happen today, that you don't think you're a star because you have to feel like one. No, I want us to learn a lesson here from Solomon today, that you are all stars because God has made you stars. So the lesson for today's sermon is from, not Matthew, I got to turn the page. 1 Kings chapter 10, verses 1 through 9. Okay, this is the story of King Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. When the Queen of Sheba heard about the fame of Solomon and his relationship to the Lord, she came to test Solomon with hard questions. Arriving at Jerusalem with a very great caravan, with camels carrying spices, large quantities of gold, precious stones, she came to Solomon and talked with him about all that she had on her mind. Solomon answered all her questions. Nothing was too hard for the king to explain to her. When the Queen of Sheba saw all the wisdom Solomon and the palace he had built and the food on his table and the seating of his officials and the attending of his servants and their robes and the cupbearers and the burnt offerings he made at the temple of the Lord, she was overwhelmed. She said to the king, "The report I have heard in my own country about your achievements and your wisdom is true. But I did not believe these things until I came and saw it with my own eyes. Indeed, not even half of what was told me, or not even half was told me. In wisdom and wealth, you have far exceeded the report I've heard. How happy your people must be. How happy your officials who continually stand before you and hear your wisdom. Praise be to the Lord your God, who has delighted in you and placed you on the throne of Israel, because the Lord's eternal love for Israel has made you king to maintain justice and righteousness. This is the story of Solomon and the Queen of Sheba. So maybe a little background is important. Maybe you don't know who Solomon is. Solomon is one of the kings of Israel, the most famous and the most wealthy of the kings of Israel. He was David's son, and after David passed away, Solomon became king, and God came to Solomon and said, Solomon, ask for anything and I'll give it to you. And Solomon didn't ask for wealth, and he didn't ask for a long life or the death of his enemies, but instead he asked for wisdom. Wisdom to rule God's people. And the Lord was pleased with that request, and so he gave him wisdom. But beyond the wisdom, he was going to give him wealth and fame and a good long reign. God said, I'm going to bless you with these things. And boy, did he ever. Right? Like, I read something the other day. It was pretty amazing. Solomon was the second wealthiest person to ever live. Second only to... Anyone? Genghis Khan. I was like, oh, that's interesting. Yeah, fascinating. If Solomon's money was converted to modern day currency, you could take all the money of Elon Musk and all the money of Jeff Bezos, add it together, and you still wouldn't have as much money as Solomon had. Right? One of the things that it says in 1 Kings when it talks about what it was like to be living in Jerusalem at the time of Solomon was that silver was like pennies, because there was so much gold in the city that even the people were like, oh, that's just silver. We don't deal with silver. We only deal with gold. I mean, all of Solomon's servants had golden shields. Every single article of cups and silverware and plates at his table was made of gold. Solomon built palaces that were called the Forest of Lebanon because there were so many cedars in it. The temple that Solomon built was just incredible. This ginormous, perfectly symmetrical temple that was built so architectural engineering marvel that like not one beam went into a wall, but everything was resting on each other perfect, like just amazing. And the inside was covered in gold. And there were two huge bronze pillars in the front entrance. I mean, it was just this amazing, wonderful place that God had blessed Solomon with. But on top of that was the wisdom. He administered this vast empire so well. He had administrators in the correct places. He had officials. He had servants. He judged well. But on top of that, it's interesting that in 1 Kings, Solomon taught people biology. He would talk about the trees, and he would talk about the animals and plant life. Like, he was a scientist on top of all of this. And so all of these things, the wealth and the wisdom and the glory and the reputation, word got out to the queen of Sheba. Where is Sheba? Possibly Ethiopia, possibly southern Egypt, possibly a daughter of Pharaoh. We don't know who exactly she was, but she's a queen. And she came with a lot of wealth. And she wanted to see for herself if what she heard was true. So she shows up to Jerusalem. And she talks with Solomon. And he's able to answer every single one of her tough riddles. And she sees the city. And she sees the wisdom, she sees the wealth, she sees the people, she sees the servants, she sees the gold shields. And then she goes with Solomon to the temple, and she sees the temple in all of its glory and splendor, and she sees the sacrifices, she sees it all. And it says she's overwhelmed. And that's fascinating to me. Because she's not a Jew. Right? Like, I don't know if you guys struggle with what about everyone who wasn't a Jew, right? I'm saying, like, what about everyone who wasn't a descendant of Abraham, who wasn't an Israelite, who wasn't a part of God's chosen people? You know, like, what did they do Were they just, sorry, you're outside of the group, so you're going to hell? No, she was drawn to Solomon, and by being drawn to Solomon was then overwhelmed. And you hear this confession where she says, "Praise be to the Lord your God who has delighted in you and placed you on the throne of Israel. Because of God's eternal love for Israel, he has made you king to maintain justice and righteousness." What happened to the Queen of Sheba? She became a believer. And you could say, like, well, is she really, or is she just tooting Solomon's horn? Like, no, Jesus himself talks about the Queen of Sheba and says she is going to be the one who's going to hold y'all accountable, who have me in front of you, and she believed and you guys aren't. Right? So like Jesus said, she became a believer. And that's what's the theme here. Look at what God's doing. Right? Do we focus our attention on Solomon and we go, wow, look at all of his wealth, look at all of his glory, look at all of his wisdom. That drew the Queen of Sheba in, and that brought her to God. Well, yeah, it did. But who is it that gave Solomon the wealth and the wisdom and the glory and the honor? That was all from God. See, God used Solomon to draw in people from outside of Israel to him. For lack of a better illustration, Solomon was a mosquito light. No, what are those called? Oh, the bug zapper. A bug zapper, right? The light that draws the bugs in. Solomon's glory drew in the Queen of Sheba, and she came to faith. Is that the way God works? Is there another time that you can think of where God used some sort of glorious, shining thing to draw people close to Jesus? And the Magi? Right? The star that's in the sky, God used that to bring the Magi to come and find who? Jesus. Right? And so Solomon, in his glory, drew the Queen of Sheba to God. The star drew in the Magi to Jesus. And what's the star and what's the Solomon today? Who are the bug zappers? You. You are all stars that God uses, that God glorifies to draw people to himself. And this is where you're probably going to go, yeah, no. I am no Solomon. I do not have wealth. I do not have glory. I do not have wisdom. I don't have this great splendor. I am no star. What do you mean? God uses me to draw people to himself? No, that's not me. I don't feel like a star. But you are. No, you shine bright with the gospel. This little gospel light of mine. I'm going to let it shine. See, Solomon shined, but it wasn't about the wealth. It wasn't about the wisdom. The thing that shined with Solomon was that wealth and that wisdom came with a story that I'm sure he told the Queen of Sheba. Yeah, so I was there and I had a dream and God appeared to me and he said, ask for whatever you wish and you'll give it to me. And I asked for wisdom and he blessed me over and above. And the Queen of Sheba heard this and she went, wow, look at your God who fulfills his promises to you. And where did she go with Solomon? Do you remember? The temple. The temple was hugely symbolic. The entire inside was filled with gold, not to just be like, wow, that's so amazing, but it was a picture of heaven. And the Holy of Holies was in the temple. Who hung out in the Holy of Holies? God did. And so the temple was a representation of God being united with his people, to dwell with his people. And what was done at the temple? Sacrifices. And so there at the temple, the Queen of Sheba is seeing that there has to be a sacrifice for sin in order for God to be able to dwell with his people who are sinful. But the blood covers the sin. And she sees all of this. She sees the gospel. And it's the light of the gospel that brought her to God. And that's what you have. Every single one of you shines with the light of the gospel, whether you feel it or not. Right? Whether you're a perfect student or not, you have a God who sees you as perfect. Whether you're a perfect mother or not, God says you are holy and perfect and cherished. Whether you're a great American man who's working hard and providing for his family where that all crumbles and fails, God says you are honored by me and I am proud of you because my son took away your sins. See, you may not feel like you are a star, but you shine with the light of the gospel. And the way that you shine out into the world is going to draw people to Jesus, who is the light of the world. What's fun is that each and every single one of you gets to preach your own unique gospel sermon in the way that you live your life. Each one of you gets to preach your own unique gospel sermon in the way that you live your life. Okay, how did Solomon preach his gospel sermon? He was faithful to the Lord, right? The wealth and the wisdom and the glory, God used that to preach the gospel, and it brought in the Queen of Sheba. You could be a pastor and stand up here and preach a gospel sermon, and that could be your way of preaching a gospel sermon. Or you could just go to work. You could go to work and you could have a bad boss. And you could forgive him in front of a coworker, even though you were deeply wronged. And yet you forgive and you forget and you love because of the way that Christ loved you, and that coworker will see that. Right? You might feel like someone who's just abused at work, and yet God's using you to let your gospel light shine. You're a star. Right? Or maybe you're an addict. Maybe you're an addict and you feel anything but like a star. And yet the addict who's then struggling against this temptation and this disease and struggling and finding rest and power in God and Christ and forgiveness and identity can be sitting around a group of addicts and letting a gospel light shine there with their own unique sermon. You could be sitting on your deathbed, unable to do anything, in hospice care, not contributing to society in any way, but feeling guilty because you feel like you're causing a burden to everyone else. And yet, wasn't it Pastor Fleischman who said to the daughter who was going every day to see her granddaughter or to see her grandmother, no, you keep doing that because with the grandmother and with the daughter coming every single day, you're showing love, and who's seeing that is the nurse or the janitor or the receptionist. What are they seeing is they're seeing the gospel light shine in their own unique way. Sorry for another analogy, but you know what you are? You're not just bug zappers, you are disco balls. A disco ball is worthless if there's no light shining on it, right? A disco ball does not spread out its own light. What does it do? It simply shines out a different light source. You are all disco balls. You don't shine out into the world, and you have to find this light from within. And so there's a lot of pressure to be this perfect person or to go out and grab as many people. No. Did you hear what the apostle said in Acts? For this is what the Lord has commanded us. I, the Lord, have made you a light for the Gentiles, that you may bring salvation to the ends of the earth. You simply shine the light of the gospel that God has shined into you. And so the pressure is off. This is an evangelism sermon at the end of the day, isn't it? God is using us to go and spread his light out into the world. Because that's what Epiphany is all about, is Jesus the light for the Gentiles. But the thing is, God uses you to shine that light out into the world. Don't feel the pressure of like, okay, now I better go do it. No, you have your own unique way of preaching your gospel light sermon. And God's going to use you in exactly the way that he wants to use you. And then God's going to shine that light out to the people exactly who he wants to shine that light to. So they're drawn into the light of the gospel and they come to him. You know who's doing all the work? God is. You know what you get to be? Simply the star. So, being filled with the gospel light and being the star that God has made you, go out into the world and shine for Jesus. Amen.